Now, why don't you go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 24. That's where we'll be spending our time this morning. Matthew chapter 24. I'm going to start with this, though. I believe all of you, most of you, have met our dog Max. And the only way to describe Max is the dog is absolutely nuts. Yeah, he's a good boy, my wife says, but he is nuts. And it's gotten worse. I think he's... Didn't you start him on some antidepressant, anti-anxiety drug or something like that?
It's on a regular basis when he goes, when he has to go to the vet or the bathroom.
He is definitely Amy's dog. Now, the first dog we had was one that I got when we were single, and he was my dog, but then became Amy's dog after we got married. His affections obviously moved to her. And then we got Max after Phoebe had died, and from day one, he has been Amy's dog. She actually owns his affections. It's not that he doesn't love me. Like last night, I was sitting on the couch and he kept coming up and he was trying to play with my feet and teasing me a little bit and stuff. So he still likes me, but boy, Amy is his. And part of the reason we know that is because when one of us comes home, for instance, I come home from work, if Amy's been gone, I come into the door, he looks and he sees me, but immediately he's looking for Amy. And he starts whining and yapping and sometimes even barking, and he starts turning like in a circle and he keeps going to the door. And there's been times where I've reopened up the door and I went, Max, she's not here, and he's looking, and it takes him a while to settle down. But he gets physically excited at the thought of her arriving home. He thinks that she's going to be there because me or Katie have come in the door. And even when she is, he still kind of goes nuts and he wants to go outside, and when he sees her. Now, silly example, but today we're going to be talking about the return of Christ. And in some respects, I'm going to say we should be like Max. There should be this excitement, this expectation, this longing, this looking and expecting. He's so used to us when we come home together, especially if it's been a trip, that Amy's going to be coming in after one of us does. He just knows that and expects that, which is why when just me or Katie walk in the door, he's still expecting Amy to be coming through. It's a pattern. He's looking for it. And in some respects, I think that's a good example of how we are supposed to be with Christ. And we're going to look at that today. We're going to look at 5 parables from what's called the Olivet Discourse. It's called that because Jesus gave this sermon, if you will, on the Mount of Olives. And so we're going to look at, there's a whole slew of parables within this passage today. And I'm going to give us a word of caution here in that we could spend on some of these parables a full morning. Maybe even more, on just a single parable. But instead of doing that, I wanted to sort of encapsulate it and get the big picture. And so we're going to look at these 5 parables, but we're not going to satisfy maybe some of your things as you're looking at them. You're going to go, I want to spend a little bit of time on that. We're not going to be able to do that this morning. Now maybe we can come back at some point and do that. So there's going to be stuff we're going to gloss over because, again, I want to give us, as Dustin refers to it, a 60,000-foot view. Because there's primarily 3 things that Jesus emphasizes today as we look at these 5 parables. And I really want to get the big picture for us. So, let's talk about the context first. The immediate context of these parables is, again, what's called the Olivet Discourse. You find it in Matthew 24 and 25. That's the largest discussion. That's the largest recording of this event. But it's also found in Mark chapter 13 and Luke 21 to a much smaller degree. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time in Matthew 24 and 25. Now there's some things that we need to look at to kind of give us the context of what was taking place here. All of this takes place during Jesus' last week. It's shortly after or before his crucifixion, but it's after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And it's actually after the opposition to the religious leaders has reached its peak. Remember all the conflict he had with them. Immediately before this are what we refer to as the 7 woes. It's where Jesus pronounced judgment upon the Pharisees, and it is almost scary, if you will, because he just repeats these words of woe to you because of the judgment that's going to come upon the Pharisees. I want you to look at chapter 23 of Matthew. Just jump down to verse 32. This is Jesus' last words at the end of these woes to these Pharisees. Matthew 23, verse 32. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. He basically says, get to it. Just full tilt, all out on your sin and your guilt. Go ahead. Fill the cup of guilt. Go ahead. Verse 33, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? That is, can you imagine that? That is blunt. Fill up your sins. How are you going to escape hell? And he goes on, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and you will crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous bloodshed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. He's referring to the Pharisees there. 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I have wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Talk about some condemnation against the Pharisees, the religious leaders. And you notice here, he places the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, the entire earth. He places all of that onto these Pharisees and these Sadducees and these religious leaders. Why is that? If you remember the prophecy given to Abraham that all the earth would be blessed, all the nations would be blessed through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Ultimately, why? Because the Messiah would come through him. And here they are rejecting the Messiah themselves, but also trying to get Israel to reject the Messiah, and they're going to put him on a cross. So for that reason, all the guilt is placed on them. And so Jesus condemns them for that. Their job was to lead people to the Messiah, and instead they were pushing people away. So what Jesus did here was threefold. He prophesied the judgment and the desolation that was about to come upon Israel and their religious system and their religious leaders. Pronounced judgment upon it. Second thing he did was he declared a new era of prophets and scribes. Those who would come out of the church, who would share the gospel, who would shepherd God's people appropriately. And then thirdly, he foreshadowed his return at a time when Israel would ultimately recognize him and accept him as Lord. So those three things are taking place here. He basically prophesies judgment against them. He declares a new era of prophets and scribes and teachers and shepherds. And he foreshadows his own return in a time where Israel will finally come and bow before him and accept him as Lord and Savior. After this section of Scripture here, it turns more specifically now to Jesus' return in the end of the age. So you kind of have almost a funnel. It comes down, and the last thing he mentions is his return. And now he's going to expand upon that. So he's talking to his disciples here. They're leaving the temple for the last time before his crucifixion. The disciples are marveling over the construction of the temple, partly with its beautiful stones and its marvelous buildings. It was a gorgeous structure. Jesus replied by prophesying the destruction of the temple. Look at what happens in chapter 24, verse 2. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came to the point out of the temple buildings with him. And they said to him, or he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. So they come out, they're marveling at these gorgeous buildings, and Jesus said, this is all gone. Everything's going to be torn down here. It probably caught them by surprise, because a short time later, when they arrived at what's called the Limestone Summit, it's just east of the city, it's the Mount of Olives, they're looking back at that, and they asked Jesus about that. Look at what he said. What happens in Verse 3, it says, "And he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" So they're essentially just asking him all these things you just told us about the destruction, about the judgment, about your coming, about the prophets and the scribes and all that. When is that going to happen? They're curious, as they should be. Now what's interesting is I believe that when they, most people kind of assume that when they say, when are these things going to happen, they're only referring to the destruction of the temple. I think the problem with that is that Jesus had just used this phrase, "these things," multiple times. And in that context, if we would have been there listening to Jesus say, "these things, these things, these things," the assumption is going to be, when are all these things going to happen? Not just the destruction of the temple. So what the disciples are asking here is not just about the destruction of the temple, but all the things that Jesus has just prophesied. When are they going to happen? If you jumped back into, I think it's verse 36, Jesus says, all these things would come upon this generation. He's referring, in that context there, to all the judgment that he had just talked about. They're all related. They all happen together. When you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, it's clear that the disciples made that correlation between the destruction of the temple, Jesus' return, the end of the age, the judgment of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All of that they understood as relating to, in some respects, happening at the same time, or at least correlated all together. And they were curious. They understood that Israel would be judged. They understood the Pharisees were being judged. They understood that Jesus' return, the end of the age, and the destruction of the temple would all be somehow related. And they wanted to know primarily two things, the text tells us. The first question that they really ask is, when will these things occur? Give us the date and time. Can we put it on a calendar? When is it going to happen? I would say Jesus didn't directly answer the question. He gives an answer, but he doesn't give a direct answer. Look at 24, verse 34. The closest we get to Jesus providing an answer to that question is verse 34. "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So we do know that at least some aspect of that would happen within a single generation. Now there's all kinds of debate on this phrase, this generation. What does it mean? And those who hold to a pre-trib view will say, well, it didn't really mean this generation at that time. It meant that generation sometime in the future. And you've got to do some hermeneutical gymnastics to make that work. Okay? This generation can also refer to not specifically a period of time, but a group of individuals. And when Jesus earlier looks at the Pharisees and uses that same phrase, this generation, he's referring to that particular group of Pharisees. Not the time, but the group. And so there is some evidence that this phrase, generation, can refer to a group of people, not simply a period of time. And so there's all this controversy, if you will, as to how to interpret what Jesus meant there with this generation. And in the end, I take the simplest approach, which is that Jesus was likely referring to this generation, but meaning that particular group of individuals at that period of time. But if you really look at that phrase, these things, it doesn't always mean the same thing. Jesus uses that phrase repeatedly to refer to different things. Sometimes he's referring, I believe, to that generation, meaning that group of people living at that particular time. Sometimes when he says this generation, the context suggests that it's a specific group of people, like the Pharisees that he has in mind. Sometimes he uses it to refer to everything. All of these things. And so it's a difficult thing to work through, but my conclusion on this matter is that we can't just define these things or this generation as one thing. You have to really be careful and look at the intricacies. It's much like if I were talking to you and I said, hey, these things, and I'm referring to this over here, and then I go over and I do this, and I say, these things, am I referring to exactly the same thing? No. And so you have to kind of work through the context that way. And so I don't think there's an easy answer. But my point is here that the closest Jesus gets to an answer here is he does say that some of these things will happen within the lifetime of those who are listening to him. Now, we know what happened at AD 70. Rome came in, ransacked Jerusalem. Well over 1 million Jews were killed. Josephus describes it as the blood was so thick in the streets that it was up to their ankles and their knees. Was he exaggerating? Some say he may have been. Some say he probably wasn't. It was a horrific time, and the temple literally was completely destroyed. Now, those who believe that everything that Jesus mentioned here came true in AD 70 are what are referred to as preterists. And there are those who believe that everything, including Jesus' return. However, because he wasn't physically there, it must have been metaphorical or figurative. He came in presence. And so there are people today, preterists, that would argue everything Jesus said has already been fulfilled. Okay? I reject that. Completely reject that. Because I don't think Jesus was talking about returning physically. The Scriptures repeatedly refer to seeing him, appearing in the sky, in the clouds with celestial signs. That's not a figurative return. So I would reject the preterist viewpoint. But to their point, some of the things obviously did happen. Now, what does that mean? Dustin has used this phrase before, that there's this idea of double fulfillment. I'm one of the proponents of that, meaning there are many Scriptures in the Old Testament prophecies, as well as the New, that have sort of a more immediate fulfillment, but they then are foreshadowing a larger, more permanent, or more literal fulfillment. We see that with some Old Testament prophecies. In fact, a great example is the prophecy of the Messiah coming through a virgin. If you really look at the Old Testament passage related to that, it's really more about a young woman giving birth, but it is a foreshadow of Mary giving birth to Christ. And so we would refer to that as a form of double fulfillment, which shouldn't shock us or surprise us with God's Word. And so, to the preterists' credit, some of what happened was what Jesus was referring to. So again, it's called preterism. If you want to ruin your Sunday afternoon, go look it up and read about it for a while. Make your head spin. But here's the thing. The problem with seeing everything having been fulfilled then was what Jesus says in verse 26 of chapter 24. It basically, what's that, 24, 26? But Jesus actually says that no one actually could know, that's not verse 26, hold on a second. What's that?
36.
Yeah, probably 36. Jump down here. Yep, I'm sorry, thank you, Amy. But on that day, or of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Meaning even Jesus himself couldn't say when it was going to happen. So it wouldn't make sense if Jesus said, all these things are going to happen in this generation. Why? Because he said, I don't know. Only the Father knows. Not even the angels. God hasn't told anyone yet. Now, does Jesus know today? I would argue he probably does. Why? When he was here on earth, he limited himself, meaning he didn't exercise some of his divine attributes, like foreknowledge. He deliberately did not exercise that. Chose not to know. Why? So he could be fully submissive to the Holy Spirit and allowing the Holy Spirit to guide and direct. That's exactly what the Scriptures teach. So even Jesus at that time did not know. However, I do believe he knows now. Why? He's in heaven with his Father. He's God. He would know, right? But at this time he didn't know yet. So that's partly why I don't believe all those things were fulfilled at that time. So the first question the disciples asked was, when are these things going to occur? Partially, they'll happen in this generation, but ultimately, we don't know. Not even the angels know. The second question they had is, what will be the sign of your coming, or the signs of your coming, and the end of the age? Jesus spent the bulk of the Olivet Discourse actually listing a series of signs and events that would coincide with his second coming. Go and read chapter 4 or chapter 24 and 25. What's interesting is if you look at all the things Jesus said, the signs that would precede his coming, that is an overlay to the book of Revelation. Especially the first 6 seals in Revelation. It is remarkable. In fact, those of you that were here when we did our series on eschatology, I put together some diagrams where I showed how Matthew 24 in the same order, overlays the events of the 6 seals in Revelation and how it fits like a glove. And so Jesus told them the signs to look for, things that would precede his coming. And they actually parallel the Old Testament prophecies as well. Now, it's not our purpose to flesh out all of these things here. I don't believe it was Jesus' intent to be able to even tell them exactly when it would happen or exactly how it would play out. And the reason is this. Jesus wanted them to focus not on those events themselves, but he wanted them to focus on being ready for his return. That's the point. It wasn't about all the neat details. One of my, I'll say, problems with prophecy experts, guys who spend their whole lives and only focus on this and they're all into this, is they get so wrapped up in that, all the details, but they forget the main point. All of that is for naught if you're not ready. Jesus' whole point in the Olivet Discourse was that you need to be ready for when I come back. The details are important because they'll help you to prepare, they'll help you to be ready, but it isn't about the details. It's about being ready. We had this discussion through text the last couple of days, Matt, I, and Dustin, about head knowledge and no heart knowledge, and seminary, and filling your head full of these, this mush of academic stuff, but it's really about, and what was the word the guy used? Knowing God and his ways was one of the phrases he used. Knowing God and his ways. That's exactly what this is about. And so this morning, that's the context. That leads us now into the parables themselves. And if we understand the context, we'll better understand the parables. So we're going to look at these parables today, and I've broken them down into 3 groups. The first 2 parables focus on what I'm going to call expectancy. Okay? They're all about expecting Jesus to come back. The first parable is the fig tree. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 32. Matthew chapter 24, verse 32. And again, I apologize in advance that we might not answer all your questions about these parables. But again, I want to get the big picture. So Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches are ready, when its branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that He is near, meaning Christ, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now you notice, some people like the preterist will say, see, it says right there that He would come back in this generation. No, He says all these things would happen in this generation, but I'm near, which means He's not coming back in that generation. But look at what it says. The farmer would know when summer is, or when the harvest time is coming, because leaves show up. The thing about fig trees is that the leaves come out first, the fruit comes out next. Isn't that pretty typical of other plants? But the point is, a farmer would know when to expect figs based on when the leaves came out on the fig tree. So, as soon as he saw those leaves come out, he began to expect the harvest, would plan for the harvest. That's the point of the parable there. It's one of, here's how you know. You see the leaves, you expect a harvest. That's partly why Jesus, remember with the fig tree, he came out, he saw the fig tree, and he saw leaves on it, he cursed it because it had no fruit. Why? Some would say it wasn't the right time for fruit anyway, and so why did Jesus curse the fig tree? Because it had leaves on it. Doesn't matter whether it was the right season or not. The fact is that the bush, the fig tree went, here's my leaves, fruit should be coming. There's no fruit. So he cursed it, because that's the way it's supposed to work. So the first thing we see with this first parable is it's about expectancy. See these things? You should expect. How that correlates to Jesus? Jesus just gave them a whole list of things to look for. He says, when you see these things, expect that I'm coming. Doesn't say when. With the fig tree, it's a little bit easier because you can count the days and the months. You kind of know that, okay, 4 seasons, etc. But that's not the point of that parable. That's just simply one truth. When you see the leaves, you know fruit's coming. That's the point. The second parable is the homeowner and the thief. Look at verse 42 of chapter 24. He says, "Therefore, be on alert, for you do not know which day the Lord is coming. Be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known what time the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert, and he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think that he will." This parable is also about expectancy. Now, most of the homes in the ancient Near East weren't fortified. Most of them didn't have locked doors even. Their windows typically didn't lock. Sometimes they didn't even have windows. Just had cut-out openings. They didn't have Simply Safe or Brinks alarm system, that could notify the authorities if somebody broke in. So it's a bit more challenging to protect what was in their home, which is oftentimes why they buried their wealth or other things in the ground, Just wasn't nearly as secure or safe, right? So Jesus paints this picture here, this parable of somebody who owns a home. And if he's told a thief's coming tonight, then he should expect the thief to come and he can better protect his home. Again, the idea is expectancy there. He can protect his home if he knows when he can expect the thief to arrive. That's the point. And so both of these parables are stressing the idea of expectancy, which essentially means that we are to be ready for Christ's return by being expectant. We should expect him to return. There was a gentleman who was on our elder board when I was attending Pastor Krenz's church back home shortly after college. I got to know him real well. His name was Tim. He was what we referred to back then as a direct mail expert, marketing expert. He would write campaign letters and other things for churches and for ministries. In fact, back in the 80s, if you ever got a letter from Chuck Swindoll, or not from Chuck Swindoll, from, who is the Focus on the Family? Name? Dobson, James Dobson, there we go. Oh, forgot it. If you got a letter from James Dobson, it wasn't written by James Dobson. It was written by my friend Tim. It was one of his biggest clients. I got to know Tim real well. He was very intellectual. We would sit down and we would talk, And I go away to seminary for my first semester. And I came back to do an internship then at the church for the summer. And I showed up for the first day of my internship back at the church, and I think I might have brought up Tim. Hey, I'm looking forward to seeing Tim, and Pastor Krenz went, well, we're having some issues with that. I'm like, what's going on? He's like, well, Tim has been getting caught up in some theology where he doesn't believe that Jesus is going to return. It was a form of preterism. He had gotten hooked up with Gary DeMar and some others, and so I'm like, wow, what in the world was with that? He goes, we don't know. But he started putting books in our library. He was an elder. Started putting books in the library saying that Christ wasn't coming back again, that there was no rapture coming, and all of that. And he said, we have tried to talk to him as a church family. The elders have tried to talk to him. However, he's insisted that the only one he'll really sit down and talk to is you. So we've kind of put this thing on hold. We'd like you to talk to him. So I went in and I sat down, met him in his office, and I sat down with him, began to talk. And it was really clear that he no longer believed. And he's like, Christ has already come, there's no rapture. It became this whole dominion theology type thing where, it's just going to get better, and then, Christ will come back, but not in the form of a rapture or a second coming. It's once we Christianize the world, that's the coming of Christ, etc. There was absolutely no expectancy at all. Ultimately, in the end, because he was an elder, because he was teaching a class and was teaching this in class, he was ultimately removed from the elder board and then finally removed from the church. It was a difficult thing to do. The last email that I had received to him was a quote from the scriptures, "You do not know the word or the power of God." That was his last phrase to me. Claiming I was an idiot, I didn't understand the scriptures, that he did, and only he alone. Well, fortunately, about 6 or 7 years later, I literally will say it this way, he came back to the church with his tail between his legs, humbled. He couldn't find a place to go to church because every church he went to rejected him because of his theology. Because what he was teaching at that time was heresy. There are certain things that rise to heresy. And he was so humbled that he came back to the church and said, I was wrong. It worked out the way it should have in that case. But my point is that there was no expectancy, and it destroyed his spiritual life. He became this shell of who he used to be. There was no hope, there was depression, there was anxiety, nothing to look forward to. He had been misled. We're to expect. And that's what Jesus says here. We'll come back to that in our takeaways. Let's go on to the next two parables. These aren't necessarily in order, but the next two parables I want to cover actually stress faithfulness. The first parable is what I refer to as the two kinds of servants. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 45. Matthew 24, verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave who his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave who his master finds doing so when he comes. Truly I say that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming home for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at that hour which he does not know. And he will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this parable describes a master who goes away on a journey, and he puts some responsibility into the hands of the slaves. He puts them in charge of his household, which is his family and his other servants. He says, your job is to feed them. It's to care for them. But then he describes two kinds of slaves. The first slave is one he refers to as faithful and sensible. This slave, he says, is faithful and sensible because he takes his newfound responsibilities that are given to him seriously. He does exactly what is expected of him by his master. He feeds the family. He takes care of people. So when the master comes back, everything is as it should be. His family's been well fed. His other slaves have been taken care of. So everything he expected of this slave has been faithfully executed. I think about that when it comes to my own job. Many of you know that a number of years ago I got a new boss, and it wasn't working out real well. He had never managed before and didn't trust any of us employees. At least it didn't seem like he did. And there were some issues that he created for my Kansas operation and blamed me for the issues he created. And so it came out of this confrontation where he sat me down and called me out on it and said a lot of things that were untrue. And then he cut my salary. And I had a decision to make. And ultimately the decision I made was, well, I'm going to double down. I'm going to serve him faithfully. And I made it my goal and my mission that even though I had been wronged, that maybe if I doubled down and could show him that what I was interested in was faithfully accomplishing the tasks that he was responsible for, that maybe that would speak something to him as a witness. And so, ever since then, and the relationship now is fantastic. I love him. I even believe he's a believer. I think he's kind of one of those quiet believers, but we've talked. Sounds like he might even be saved. He goes to church with his wife. He thoroughly enjoys it. It's an evangelical church. There's some things there that suggest that maybe he's saved. He referred to himself as a Christian the other day. But not too long ago, I noticed how overwhelmed he was. And he had been having things placed on him by my old boss, because my old boss was now the IT director, and he was getting stuff put on him by corporate, and it was crushing both Jay and Scott. And so I started reaching out to Scott saying, look, buddy, what can I take off your plate? What can I do to help these things? And some of those things he couldn't hand over, but there were some things he finally was like, well, could you help with this? I'm like, yes, I'll do that. And I really sort of doubled down, and I'm like, and I told him this, I'm like, Scott, I want to help you. And So whatever I can, just trust me. You know you can trust me with this. And so he started doing that. Well, 6-8 months later, he and the IT director, JMO boss, called me. And for the first time in my life at Chicago Title, I was given a raise that I didn't have to ask for and prove I was worthy of. They came out, and the reason they said was, boy, the things you've done, we want to be able to trust you with other things. So, we want to raise your salary, and we're going to expect that we can give you some more things from our plate. And these are things that are all reserved for managers. I'm not the one supposed to be doing them. And I said, great. As long as you don't expect me to be a manager, because I don't want the stress you guys are going through. But, I said this, and I don't say this to my credit, it's just trying to give you an example here that I said, look guys, what I want to do is I want you guys to look good to your corporate bosses. You don't need to give me any credit for any of the things I do. My name doesn't have to be on any of this stuff, because my job is to accomplish what you guys need to prove to corporate. So if I can do that, that's all I want. And so that's my goal now. With everything I do at work, I look at it and go, you know what? They've been tasked with having this done. My job is to help them get it done. I don't need my name on it. I just want to be a faithful employee. That's all I want. And again, I don't say that to puff myself up. I had to learn that. That's what we see here is Jesus is saying that this servant was given a task to do and he did it faithfully. I don't want Scott or Jay to worry when they ask me to take over a project or do something. I don't want them to wonder, is it going to get done? I want them to be able to go, done, forgot about it. We know it'll be done, we'll check in when it's finished. That's all I want. That's what this master did. Now, the other kind of slave that he mentions here, not so much. The second kind of slave he refers to as an evil slave. Evil slave. He's evil because he doesn't believe his master is going to return for a long time. He doesn't take his newfound responsibility seriously. Instead of caring for his master's household, he goes out on a bender. He beats his fellow slaves. He mistreats them. He goes out eating and drinking with a bunch of drunkards, it says. As a result, when his master returns unexpectedly, he faces what can only be described as the wrath of his master. Go back to verse 51. What does it say there? You're going to be cut up into pieces. Now, obviously, Jesus is using hyperbole there. He's not suggesting that really go out and dismember these people. He's trying to drive home a point, that you have a faithful servant. And what I find interesting here, and I don't know how far we can take this, but the only two options here are a faithful servant or an evil servant. It's not like, well, there's a faithful servant, then there's sort of a pseudo-faithful servant. And then there's a servant who's just not faithful at all. And then there's the evil servant. He only gives two things here. There's a faithful servant. There's the evil servant. We're going to get into the sheep and the goats. I keep saying sheep. Sheep and the goats in a week or two. It's only one or the other. There's no middle ground. Jesus elsewhere in the book of Revelation says, I wish you were either hot or cold. Only options. So the second slave is evil. Now, what's interesting with this particular parable, I think there are allusions here to the church and the Pharisees. I still think he has the Pharisees in mind. The Pharisees are the wicked, evil servants. The church is supposed to be the faithful servant. So there's some allusions there. So that's the first parable in the section on, it's about faithfulness, because now he's talking about to be ready for the return, you need to be faithful. He goes on with another parable. I refer to it as the parable of the talents, because that's what most people do. Jump down to verse 13 of chapter 25. Be on alert then, for you do not know the day or the hour. For it is just like the man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. This is very much like the last parable. Very similar. To the one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. Immediately, the one who had received the 5 talents went ahead and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted me 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Also the one who had received 2 talents came and he said, "Master, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I have gained 2 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." And the one who had received the 1 talent came and said, "Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you didn't scatter seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, here's what's yours." But his master answered and said to him, "You wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank. On my arrival, I would at least have my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have will be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So this parable is very similar to the last one. You have this master who goes away, and once again he places his possessions, gives responsibility to his servants, and he expects them to be faithful. So when he gives the first one the talents, he expects them to at least come back and have them have made more talents. Invest it. He does that with the second one. He does that with the third, and that's what he expects. Now what I love about this, as you notice here, it says that he gave to each one in verse 15 according to his ability. I think that's important because he didn't expect or have these unreasonable expectations. He gave to each one. The reason he gave the one slave 5 is he knew he could handle the 5, or expected him to be able to. But the next one he only gave 2. Why? His abilities weren't the same. And so he gave him what was according to his abilities. He could handle this. Okay? There are guys that I work with. We've hired a brand new guy who's, I think, 25. Okay? He's fresh out of college. He's been working in another business for a couple of years. And so yesterday my boss had mentioned to me, or Friday he mentioned to me, he's like, "Yeah, going to be a lot of time I got to spend with this guy to bring him up to speed." And I offered, I said, "Scott, you know what? Any of that I can help train him. I've been doing this for 30 years now. But it's going to take a while to bring him up to speed, okay? You would not give him some of the same responsibilities that I've had, because he doesn't have the experience for it yet." So I love this, and it says he gave to each one according to their abilities, okay? Which means the first 2 lived up to their responsibility, did what they were capable of doing, but the last one didn't even do what he was capable of doing. That's why he's lazy and worthless. It doesn't say he couldn't do it. He was just lazy. He was called wicked, worthless, okay? If we spent more time on this, we could get into how does this relate to us. I believe that there is an allusion here, illusion, to the Great Commission. Jesus has given us responsibilities according to our abilities, according to our spiritual gifting, that we are to use to advance His kingdom, and He expects us to use them, expects us to invest them. That's part of being faithful. You are now a member of the body of Christ. Here's your gifting. Go out there now and use it to grow the body of Christ. That's the expectation. If you don't do that, you're a worthless and wicked slave. It's not my words. It's what's found here. There are too many Christians that sit on their butts, don't use the gifts and abilities God has given them to advance the kingdom. If that makes your skin bristle a little bit, it's okay. I didn't say it. It's here. It doesn't mean that a person who's not gifted in evangelism has to go out and be an evangelist. 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 explain to us how the gifts work. We're all gifted in some form or fashion. We ought to figure out what it is and use it to invest in the kingdom. That's what it means to be faithful. So, the second thing we see stressed in these parables is that to be ready means that we are to be faithful. And what's interesting about this is faithfulness comes in some different ways. There's the idea of just faithfulness in terms of your walk with Christ, and that's obviously in mind here, meaning stay faithful, hold tightly to Christ. Okay? We know Christians, you got this whole deconstruction movement now, where you got people who are raised in Christian homes or whatever, and they're abandoning the faith to some other new, weird, fangled sort of faith that maybe resembles Christianity but mixes a bunch of other crud into it. You know? There's that part of faithfulness. But you notice here with this passage, the emphasis isn't so much on that as it is doing what the Master gave you to do. That's the faithfulness that's in mind here. And if we are to be faithful, that means we ought to be busy about doing what Christ has asked us to do. It isn't just about our personal walk with Christ. It's, are you investing through the gifts that I've given to you? He has assigned us the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. We're supposed to be doing that. So that's faithfulness. The final parable, I believe, has the emphasis or the focus of preparedness. Preparedness. Look at the parable of the 10 virgins. And this, again, I think Dustin spent a whole Sunday on this with some teaching. I don't know if he did it for us or not. I don't remember. But he's got a whole message on just the parable of the 10 virgins. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. Then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. In other words, they only took the oil that was inside the lamps. They didn't take extra oil with them. But the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps, meaning they had extra oil with them. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out and meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, "Give us some oil, some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the prudent answered, "No, there will be not enough for us to use. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the other virgins also came, saying, "Lord, Lord, open up for us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I don't know you. Be on alert then, for you do not know the day or the hour." So what's the point of this? It's all about preparedness. You notice what you have here is the wedding ceremony. The way it worked in Israel is the bridegroom or the maids and all that would all be sort of ready, and they'd be waiting. The bride would be waiting at home. Didn't know what time the bridegroom was coming. It was sometime expected during the day, typically the evening hours. So they were prepared. They were waiting for him to come. And it says that 5 of them took their lamps, but also took an extra flask of oil. Why? You never know what time he's coming. It could be a long wait. So they were smart enough to say, well, if we run out of oil in the lamp, we've got to have enough lamps so that we have oil when he comes to keep our lights lit. The other 5 just took the lamps. They weren't prepared for a long evening. And what happens? In this particular instance, the bridegroom is delayed for whatever reason. And so because of the long wait, 5 of the bridesmaids, their oil starts to run out. The other 5 have extra oil. Well, when the 5 realize we're not going to have enough, they start begging the others. Well, they say, wait a minute, if we give you ours, we don't have it. We're prepared. You can go somewhere else. So when they leave to go buy the oil, what happens? Bridegroom comes. They miss it. So he comes, the other 5 go with him, show up at the wedding, close the door. The other 5 show up, bridegroom's not here. Oh no, we missed it. They start running to get there, banging on the door, let us in. He's like, I don't know who you are. You weren't prepared. That's the point of this parable. Now again, we could get all kinds of great stuff out of this if we spent a whole morning on it. But the emphasis of this is to be prepared. So let's talk about the takeaways on all this. I left them all for the end here. Again, because I want to stress them. There's 3 primary themes, again, that we see laid out in these 3 parables. And they all have to do with the idea of how are we ready? How to be ready for when Jesus returns. It's not a question of if. It's not even really a question of when. It's a question of how do we prepare? for the return of Christ. And the first thing we saw is that to be ready for Jesus' return, we have to be expectant. We have to expect him to come back. We ought to be like Max. And when I talk about expectant there, I'm not just saying, yeah, he's going to come back. No, we literally ought to be looking for him. We ought to be like Max. Something happens, we ought to be going, is he coming? There is so much going on in our world today that if we are not going, man, he could. If we're not doing that, we're not expectant. Oh yeah, he's coming back. That's not expectant. That's head knowledge. What if we're spinning in circles and going, okay, look at all this stuff that Jesus said was going to happen. Now, he may or may not come back in our lifetime, folks. But you know what? We are closer than ever. And there are an awful lot of things today that really look very similar to what Jesus described. We ought to be expectant. John chapter 14, verses 2 and 3, Jesus said, in my house, or in my Father's house, are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, so that where I am, you can be. He told us later that he would not leave us as orphans. In Acts chapter 1, when Jesus ascends into heaven, the angel says, why are you standing around? The way he went up, he's coming back. All of these emphasize the fact that Jesus is coming back. But you know, in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 27 and 28, I love the way that this ends. Inasmuch as it is appointed to men to die once, and after this comes a judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin. But then get this, to those who eagerly, that's the key, eagerly wait for him. That's why James reminds his readers, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. We ought to be expecting him to come back. That's what it means to be ready. We're not ready if we don't expect. And what I'm talking about, again, is that eager anticipation and expectation, looking to the clouds to see when he's coming. Now, I told you this before, I hold to more of a pre-wrath view, which means that I don't believe that he's going to come back this afternoon, because I think there's some things that have to be fulfilled before then, but I think they can be fulfilled very rapidly. And I fully expect that he's coming back in my lifetime. He may not, but I really feel and sense that he might be. I want him to. In fact, yesterday was one of those days where I was thinking through some things. I'm like, Lord, I think I'm done. You know what? As much as I love my life, I think I could take a little rapture thing happening. You know? So the first thing, to be ready, means to be expectant, with eager anticipation. We're also told that we ought to be faithful. So to be ready for Jesus' return, we must be faithful. And by that, again, I mean that we must be busy about the responsibilities and the tasks that he's given to us. Matthew 10:22, you will be hated by all because of my name, but it's the one who has endured to the end who will ultimately be saved. The book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 10 says, be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. That's talking about personal faithfulness. To the church at Sardis, he wrote in Revelation chapter 3, I'm coming quickly, hold fast what you have so that no one will take your crown. And so there he's talking about personal faithfulness, but remember these two parables focused on investing the master's stuff. That's really what faithfulness is about. I love what Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Join me there real quickly, and then we'll finish up in the next 3 or 4 minutes here. 2 Timothy chapter 4. If we could all be like Paul. 2 Timothy chapter 4. You jump down to verse 6 through 8. It's one of my favorite passages of Scripture. Paul says, actually, we'll start in verse 5. But you be sober in all things, and he's referring to Timothy. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have what? Loved his appearing. Notice that Paul ties loving his appearing, his second coming, to being faithful in the ministry that Paul had been given. So if we love his appearing, which means we'll be busy about what God has given us to do. That's being ready by being faithful. It isn't just about saying, I kept my faith. It's about, did I do what Jesus gave me to do? The last and final thing is, to be ready for Jesus' return means that we are prepared to meet him when he does come. Prepared to meet him when he does come. You guys know what a go bag is? There's a couple of different terms that are used. Go bag, bug out bag, bailout bag. I didn't realize this, but they're all three different things. A go bag apparently developed within the military, and it's this idea that a soldier ought to be ready to jump up and go with at least 3 days' supplies in his pack, because they may not know when they have to grab stuff and go. They now use that for preppers, you know. You better have a go bag in case you need to, leave the house, right? A bug out bag is very similar. A bug out bag is actually, I think, a term that was coined back during one of the Gulf Wars. And it was the idea that if your tank got hit or your military vehicle got hit, they would put a bag on the outside of the tank or the vehicle that would have the supplies they would need if they had to abandon their vehicle, and so medical other things, and they kept it on the outside. Why? Because you might not have time to grab it from the inside. You get out of the tank, you get out of the vehicle, and you grab that bag that's strapped to the side. It's a bug-out bag. And then pilots had the same thing called a bailout bag when pilots were shot down. Had to bail out of their plane. They would have a bag of whatever they might need to survive in the wilderness. And so in some respects, I would ask, do you have your go bag ready? And for us, our go bag would be the things that we do. Okay, it's not an exact parallel, but it made me think of that. There was one passage, and I'll end with this, that I've got Zion's Fire is a magazine produced by an organization that focuses on a pre-wrath view of end times. And I was reading an article there the other day, and what was interesting about it is they mentioned Matthew chapter 24. And you don't have to turn here, but it's interesting that Jesus is doing something very similar. He's talking about a second coming. And at the very end of it, it says, will the Lord find faith on the earth when he comes? I thought that is striking. Will the Lord find faith? And when I think about that in the context of what we talked about this morning, I think what we're looking at is we need to be ready for Christ to come. And we have to be ready through expectation, through faithfulness, and through preparedness. And if we do that, Christ will find faith when he comes on the earth. That's the expectation. That's the hope. And the question is whether or not we will be there to prove. Will we be able to say, yes, you have found faith on earth in me? That's the goal, right?